Hi, thank you for joining us today. We will be talking about tomatoes. This is an interview with Benjamin Scout and Rick Heffelbauer with Utah State University Extension, answering some questions that we commonly get at the Extension Office. Another question we get a lot, let's see, we have blossom end rot, which can be, some people think is the disease that tomatoes get. And blossom end rot it happens on the very bottom of a tomato is where it'll start. Usually at the tip, and it'll be kind of a callus, almost like a scab-looking gray part of the tomato.
Yeah, and blossom end rot is pretty common, and one of the things if you get blossom end rot, which like Ben says, it's kind of this dry scabby spot on the bottom, as opposed to other things that you might see on tomatoes. That's kind of how you can tell that it's end rot, because it'll be on the very bottom end. Typically, this is due to a lack of calcium. But it can be that you have calcium in the soil and it's just not being moved out to the plant at a very critical time, which is usually soon, sometime right around blossom set, when the tomatoes actually set on the vine. That's kind of a critical time. If there's not enough calcium there, that young fruit will starve for calcium and you'll get this dry spot on the bottom, which really never goes away then. Once it's on there, it stays, and it'll just get bigger and bigger as the tomato gets larger. So the first thing to do is to make sure that you're watering the tomato plants consistently, to getting enough water, and they're getting watered often enough. And if you're sure that's happening and you're still getting that blossom end rot problem, then you can increase the calcium. And that's done generally by adding a form of calcium when you're irrigating. Probably the easiest way to do it is to put it in the irrigation water, and that way it's fed directly to the plants, to the irrigation, and goes right to the root system. It's pretty difficult, and I'm not sure it's even worthwhile to actually apply some type of calcium to the soil. That just doesn't seem to work. Sometimes the calcium's there and it's still not available. So, but adding it in the form of a liquid calcium fertilizer, that seems to work pretty well.
Okay. So another one that we see with actual fruit is we get cracking quite a bit. So that's when you get your tomato, and at the stem you'll see a bunch of cracks. They'll be calloused over typically, but they'll have these large cracks in them. But what's the cause of cracking?
Well, probably the most common cause of cracking is the tomato plant getting a little too much water, particularly as the tomatoes get close to ripening. If they get too much, what happens is they grow rapidly, and then the skin isn't stretching, and of course the tomato will crack. So the easiest way to control that is to just turn the water down a bit and don't water quite as much. And finding that balance is sometimes hard, especially if you're still trying to set tomato fruits on the vine while you're picking. So that can be a little bit challenging, just like we mentioned before. But so just maybe kind of cut the water down a little bit on them, and that will probably help as much as anything that you can do. Sun scald or sunburn on a tomato will also cause cracking. And again, there's not a lot you can do for that except try to shade the tomatoes, try to give them some shade cloth. There are a few varieties around, like one some of the growers like here is called Shady Lady, and the reason it's called Shady Lady is it produces lots of foliage. So if you can grow that tomato plant in a way that the tomatoes are set, and then you let the vine come up a little bit above where they're set and create a nice kind of a foliage canopy above them, then that will help. And that's another reason sometimes people will use the string trellises. They'll put stakes between their tomato plants and use twine to hold the tomato plants up, and then that sort of creates a natural foliage canopy above the tomatoes too. So there's some things I like you can do that kind of help with the sunburn a little.
Yeah, so the sunburn, what it looks like is you have your tomato and they'll have a portion of it will be white. That's the tissue, plant tissue has actually been sunburnt so bad that it's actually dyed and it'll turn white, and the rest of the tomato will be red. Usually they're not very good. The quality is not good. Obviously, if half of it's dyed, it's probably going to start rotting, and the tomatoes usually aren't good. So shade cloth is an inexpensive way to try and get the sun off of them a little bit, and if you can get something to have the foliage, I think that's a great idea to cover those. You can reduce the damage that you're going to get by sunburn quite a bit. Another one that we've seen quite a bit is if people bring in tomatoes and they look kind of cool, they have underneath the skin, it's kind of cloudy. It has like these little puff spots that are underneath the tomato skin. It's really, you can see it when it's green, but it's really prevalent when they turn red. What causes that one? Is it a disease, or what's that one?
The most common cause for that is, and if it's like you mentioned, so if you get this cloudy spot, it'll kind of look white, and it'll kind of do that right underneath the skin. It's usually because we have stink bugs that will come in, and they have a sucking mouth part, so they pierce the outer skin on the tomato, and they feed. And so as they're feeding, there'll be a little bit of their saliva goes back into the tomato, and that kind of helps the feeding process.
Sounds appetizing.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very tasty, but then it will show up in this sort of a white spot underneath the skin of the tomato.
Okay. Do you know if those tomatoes are usable, or?
I think they're usable. I don't. I mean, if I see them, I certainly cut them out. I don't know if it really affects the flavor of the tomato, but it certainly affects the way it looks.